Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Simon Conway Morris. He is a paleobiologist I'll give you the whole bio in a second. His new book is From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, 6 Myths of Evolution. Simon is the Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology at the University of Cambridge. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society and has written several books, including Life's Solution and the Runes of Evolution. Dr. Morris has been honored with the Walcott Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, the Charles Schuchert Award from the Paleontological Society, and the Lyell Medal from the Geological Society of London, named after Charles Lyell, and the Schuchert Award is for the best and most influential paleontologist under the age of 40. He is well known for his work on the Cambrian explosion and his extensive studies on convergent evolution. I encountered his name when, after Gould wrote his book, Wonderful Life, about the Burgess Shale and the role of randomness and chance in how life turns out in evolutionary deep time. And Morris counters that and says, actually, it's not as random and contingent as Gould made it out to be. There's a kind of a directionality to evolution, almost a teleology based on this principle of convergent evolution. There's only so many ways to see the world or fly through the air or swim through the water and so on. And many, many organisms end up with the same kind of solution. That's the title of his book, Life's Solution. His other books, by the way, published by the Templeton Press. This is the Templeton Foundation that tries to bridge science and religion. His other book is The Deep Structure of Biology. Is convergence sufficiently ubiquitous to give a directional signal? Interesting. And here's his big book, The Runes of Evolution, How the Universe Became Self-Aware. What does that mean? Well, you're going to find out in this conversation, because it turns out Simon Conway Morris is also a man of faith. He seems to believe the Christian religion, and so you'll hear me pressing him on that. How does he know this? These facts about Christianity to be true? How is that different from his conclusions in science about what is true, the small t? And then what about other religions that also make truth claims, and why doesn't he accept those? And so forth. Anyway, it's a very interesting conversation in which we cover all these grand topics from biology and evolution to metaphysics, the nature of reality and truth, morality, purpose and meaning in life, and so forth. All right, enjoy this conversation with Simon Conway Morris. Okay, here we go. We're rocking and rolling. Simon Conway Morris, the legendary. Your new book is, I'll have already introduced it, but again, From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, 6 Myths of Evolution. We can go through those one by one, but I should also note that you are also the author of The Deep Structure of Biology. I listened to some of this on audio. This one's on audio. Your other ones are not on audio. Is convergence sufficiently ubiquitous to give a directional signal? What does he mean by directional? Well, we're going to find out. And of course, your big book, actually, I just had Richard Dawkins on the podcast the other day, and he was touting this as his favorite book of yours, The Runes of Evolution, How the Universe Became Self-Aware. And unlike most authors in their index, you have an index not only of subjects and people, but also of convergences, which Dawkins said he was very impressed.
That's why I wrote the book.
Impressed by that. Yes, that was quite the good. Actually, the intersection with your work through Dawkins is an interesting story you might enjoy. I had made this video years ago about just a short little kind of op-ed video on what extraterrestrial intelligences might look like, because alien abductees and the ancient alien people and all the kind of pro-UFO people that think the aliens have come here, they always portray them as these bipedal primates. And I kind of follow the line of Stephen Jay Gould and Carl Sagan that whatever the aliens are going to be like, they're not going to be like us. I mean, the chances of all those contingent steps happening in parallel on some other planet, and then them finding their way here and being much like us and doing weird sexual probe things in the bedroom in the middle of the night just all seem so unlikely. And, the aliens with gnarly stuff on their forehead, speaking English with a weird accent on Star Trek, that's the kind of limitations of Hollywood wardrobes and so forth. And I had a kind of a good laugh about it. But Dawkins countered with your work. He said, you should check out the work of Simon Conway Morris because, in fact, the aliens could be bipedal primates. Not exactly primates, but something like, all the apparatus, the brain and sensory apparatus at one end and the waste disposal on the other end. You got to have limbs to move. And you could end up with something like that. So that led me to your work-life solution and convergent evolution. And that's the connection here. So why don't we start with just kind of, for those who don't know your work, just kind of give us a little biographical sketch. Where are you from, and how did you get interested in studying evolutionary biology? And give us your contingent pathway to where you are now, or your convergent evolution to where you are now.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's not too interesting. I was born in London. In fact, I celebrated my 70th birthday the other day, and that would be an aside. Perhaps we might go back to what my birthday present was, but I'll keep that in anticipation. And I went to University of Bristol and then came to Cambridge, where I'm speaking from at the moment. And under the supervision of a chap called Harry Whittington, who'd actually spent a lot of time at Harvard, though he was English, his wife's American, worked on something called the Burgess Shale, which is now reasonably well known, in good part to Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life. And we could talk about that for an hour if you like, because I'm still quite interested in it, but it's effectively fabulously preserved fossils from around about 500 million years ago, and you could investigate the soft parts. And at that stage, I was the opinion that such was the variety of forms, and this was put out by Stephen Jay Gould later on, that the likelihood of anything like the phyla, that's the major groups we know, surviving to the present day was vanishingly small, and the dice could have gone slightly differently. And as you indicated with your introduction with regard to aliens, then quite possibly we'd have something which was, well, alien. And then, of course, being a naughty boy, I changed my mind. I'm not allowed to do that, it's very bad. Don't recommend it to do more than twice in your career. And on the rethought, and actually partly because I read one of Gould's set of essays, Bully for Brontosaurus, and he made some comments about convergence there, which I picked up. And I think that may have seeded my growing interest in the possibility that the number of endpoints in evolution is surprisingly restricted. And I was actually reading a wonderful example. I know we shouldn't get too technical, but this is a very recent paper, and effectively, if you know the insulation around a nerve, it's called myelin, and it's multilamellar. That's all we need to know. And then if you go and look at the chloroplasts, which are the things where photosynthesis happens, they're multilamellar. But actually, the convergences between something in our nervous system and something in a plant goes much, much deeper. And so fundamentally, what I'd like to try and establish is what are the overall basic similarities of biological form. And then to cut the story even shorter, I came back to Cambridge after 4 years away in the Open University, and then I've been here ever since. And since then, as you kindly indicated, this parade of books going past on the screen, that's, if you like, the sort of the magna opera of where I've been going. And this current one, which you very kindly mentioned as well, is designed to set the cat among the pigeons.
Well, I think it did. At least it did for me. But we'll get to that. I've been to the Burgess Shale. I went to Canada for a conference that a friend of mine, Greg Hart, was putting on, and it was we got to talking about Gould's book, and he said, the Burgess Shale is just a couple hour drive from here, and we could hike there. And I thought, oh my God. And so we drove to the trailhead and we hiked. It was like, I don't know, it was a couple hours, like 3 hours to get to this thing. And it was a lot. And
it's a small journey.
Yeah, it's a small journey. But we did it all in one day, up and back. And it was in June, and in Canada, that's a pretty long day. So it was like 10 o'clock at night. We're still coming down, and it's still daylight. And my buddy is yelling out, yo bears, yo bears. And I'm like, what are you doing? He goes, well, the bears, they don't like to bushwhack either. They take the trails. I'm like, oh God. Okay. But between reading Gould's book and your book about the Burgess Shale, I had in my mind this like cathedral, like massive thing. And it's really not that big. It's astonishing that it was even found there.
Well, it's a hole in the ground, as geologists tend to work, and they like to be able to see the skylight if at all possible. In parenthesis, I should say that more recently, as no doubt you and many of your viewers will know, there are other Burgess shales that turn up, especially in South China. I've done a fair amount of work there, and also in Greenland. I was lucky enough to go there. So in many ways, though, the Burgess shale, the actual quality of preservation, this is a little bit discussing the difference between Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci, but Burgess shale still just has that slight edge on all the other fossils. There's something so exquisite about that preservation. It's very exciting.
Yeah, just to clarify, so what you're looking at there, of course, are no biological remains. These are just fossilized. That is to say, they're mineralized imprints or stamps or copies of what was there. And, when I saw them, they're so flat. I mean, it's like, just like a micron thick. How do you infer, three-dimensionality from a flat surface like that?
Well, there are several ways you do it. I mean, first of all, the film in a number of the animals, especially where they have a series of appendages, in point of fact, they're separated by very thin layers of sediment. That's probably because they were transported in a turbulent cloud of mud. And so, in point of fact, and Derek Briggs, a colleague of mine who's now in Yale, showed very elegantly with regard to the group he's working on, because I was asked to work on the fossil worms, which seemed to be a bit of a joke and perhaps remains one. But Derek Briggs worked on the arthropods. You can actually drill away parts of the animal to reveal underlying pieces of it. So there's a degree of three-dimensionality to it. And the second thing Derek Briggs pointed out years and years ago was actually, oddly enough, if you take a photograph, of course, you're reducing something from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions. It's a plane. But in point of fact, because the animals are buried in different orientations, and this is something Harry Whittington appreciated very early on, and then, in fact, if you take a set of photographs of a reconstruction at different angles, you can, by changing the model of as you photograph it, you can reconcile what the photograph shows with the original fossil. So basically, it's not quite a roadkill, but the fossil itself is flattened precisely, and depending on its exact angle, that allows you to infer a great deal about the shape of the thing. It's not rocket science, but you need a very acute eye to do this. I guess I could make a claim in that area.
Yes, indeed. So, and I just want to get your opinion about Gould as a target. He seemed in his lifetime, and maybe this is true for anybody that becomes famous and it just becomes a big target and people go after them. But was there something more about his personality or his politics or something that led so many people to go after him just on so many different issues? What is your sense about that?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I mean, with respect to him, I think we somewhat diverge in opinions. This is a recommendation to everybody. Whatever happens in your life, do not become too famous. Please, just don't do it. You lose your life. You just spend your time, in the hands of other people. And, he gave particular lectures, which many people found a little too long and a little too rambling, but he attracted gigantic audiences, so who can complain about that? But I think in the end, scientifically, I suspect, I have to be a little careful what I say, because, he was a complex man, and it's a huge area. But in essence, I think he wanted to go beyond Darwinism. He fully accepted, I do, the Darwinian formulation. But he had this nervousness about directionality, which is pretty implicit in Darwin's own work, although I'm not an expert in that area. And I have been told, on what authority I forget, that in fact, deep down, and of course this is resonating today as we speak with the war in Ukraine, some of his ancestors were Jewish, I believe from Hungary, and so forth. And he felt extraordinarily strongly, and here I wouldn't disagree with him, that we can't be victims of our evolutionary history. We have to have free will. We have to be able to decide morally what we ought to do. And that, in fact, of course, might have a bearing on some of the things I'm writing at the moment. And in a way, he wanted to try and reformulate the Darwinian narrative in a way which is more sympathetic to chance and thereby allowing people, ultimately. So it's a rather complicated story. And I never, I'm afraid, shortly before he died, he published this gigantic book, which is even thicker than the Runes of Evolution. It's a real doorstop. And I'm afraid I've never been able to struggle through that. So in a nutshell, and without being unkind to him, there's no doubt, when I die, people I hope will be equally vicious. So there we go. It is in the end, the whole thing didn't quite work. But that's true of nearly all scientists. Ultimately, you don't do all the things you'd hope to do, and you fail to convince the number of people you'd like to convince. And this is not a thing of despair or anything like that. It's simply how difficult it is to work on these things and end up with a coherent, not only a coherent scientific understanding, but a coherent philosophy behind it. Mm-hmm. So I hope I'm being fair to him in that way.
Oh, no, I think you are. I largely agree with that. He was often accused of being a Marxist, which he wasn't. He said he learned Marxism at his daddy's knee. He didn't say, I became a Marxist at my daddy's knee. And in any case, his theory of contingency and the kind of role of chance and free will in history and evolution is not a Marxist theory, because a Marxist theory is, grand sweeping forces dialectical collisions between giant things. That's the opposite of what he's arguing. So in that book, Wonderful Light, the title comes from that film, Henry.
That's right.
Yeah, in which the character discovers in rewinding the tape at the end that, in fact, without him in it, in that it's a completely different timeline. I kind of took and ran with that in human history and said, well, sometimes that's the case. Sometimes the flap of a butterfly wing, ends up in a tornado in Texas. But if the tornado is already going and you're in the middle of it, it doesn't matter. You could have 1 billion butterflies flapping their wings. It won't make any difference at all.
Yeah. No, sure. I should say in parentheses, like you probably, I've got a possibly unhealthy interest in counterfactuals. And in fact, science fiction is a really interesting area there. And The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick is something like that. And the reason why I like the counterfactual so much is because, of course, it challenges some of the things I'd like to think apply to evolutionary theory. But also there's this sort of, as in the particular book by Dick, The Man in the High Castle, there's a sort of eerie sense that it really was true. And they, if I remember correctly, in the book, feel they're in the wrong history. And of course, Dick himself is a very strange writer indeed. So I wouldn't dream of being sort of, judgmental in any of these areas. I'm not sort of saying it's got to be that, it's got to be this, listen to me, children. But I think counterfactual histories are fascinatingly underrated.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's Hume's counterfactual definition of causality. A precedes B. We assume that A causes B. The sun, the rooster crows and then the sun rises. But if you counterfactually silence the rooster and the sun rises anyway, then you've determined causality. So I do think those are useful things. And that's, I think, what Gould had in mind with his, if you reran the tape. Although we should note that, as Dan Dennett pointed out, if it was a read-only memory tape, then it would have to come out exactly the same. It was because it's just a copy and you're just watching the movie unfold again. So what he really meant, and you've taken this thought experiment and run with it too, is that if you just went back in time and started over, and it could go any direction, it's not a read-only memory tape. So maybe tape is not the right word, and that's a very 1980s metaphor in any case.
That's the trouble with metaphors.
Yeah, and
metaphors are dangerous. Be careful.
Yeah. So his point was that it's so random that we wouldn't end up with anything like us, and your counter to that is not so. So walk us through your convergent evolution and why there's only so many variations on a theme, and we'd end up with something like you and me talking here today.
Well, in a certain way, I might as well put the elephant traps in position to begin with. We've got to allow the origin of life, and that's generally agreed to be a natural process. Well, I think it is. I'm sure it is. But it is not at all well understood, and it is conceivably just a set of concatenations of extremely improbable events. That's not the received wisdom, but even so, experimental work on the origin of life has not exactly been a runaway success for the last 100 years. So don't worry. More importantly, perhaps, is that, of course, we now know a very large number of extrasolar planets, and it's becoming fairly clear that probably most of them do not evolve in the way the Earth has evolved, in all sorts of different ways, and possibly with the rise of an atmosphere with oxygen in it. And linked to that is the possibility, which again, I think I can argue my way around, is the so-called evolutionary bottlenecks. In other words, there are constrictions whereby everything's got to come together at about the right time. And if that doesn't happen, then bye-bye eukaryotic cells. That is, the cells we're composed of, along with plants and mushrooms. And bye-bye, most unfortunately, goes sex, as it so happens. That was just one of the drawbacks of a bottleneck. But in point of fact, in part because of what I've referred to, and I'm sure other people have as well, and do stop me, by the way, and I wonder if either off-piste, as they say in the Alps, or actually going not too technical, but it's this thing of so-called inherency, in as much as many of the building blocks you need to make complex things have evolved in bacterial systems. So, for instance, you and I are looking at each other through a medium using lenses which are composed of so-called crystalline proteins. Now, these we know are originally evolved for stress control in single-celled organisms, and they've been recruited. And the same more or less applies to the G-coupled protein receptors in our retina and so forth. So there's a good deal of the heavy lifting has been done long before there are even eukaryotes in some cases. So that's, I think, one way round the bottleneck. And the other one is, of course, that there is convergence generally, and we could give you endless examples. I mentioned in passing this parallel between the sheath of a myelin and the arrangement of a chloroplast. But if we're sort of saying, well, how likely is it you want a human? Yes, please, thank you very much. So we're going to get locomotion going. We can have a variable number of limbs. That's quite all right. But levers are a good way of getting around. And indeed, if you look at the locomotion of a cockroach and compare it with the locomotion of a dog, although the cockroach has got 6 legs and the dog, if it's lucky, has got 4. In point of fact, the basic biomechanics and also the way in which the nervous system tells the limbs to move is basically the same. But what's the surprise? We've got to be able to see, so we'll have an eye on the shelf. Thank you very much indeed. We'll have a camera eye, if you don't mind. That's a little bit better than the so-called compound eye. Oh, and by the way, I wouldn't mind a nervous system, but that's okay. The building blocks that have been largely assembled before there was any nervous system. I may allow my brain to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's happened multiple times. I'd like to be warm-blooded. Yes, thank you, because I want a stable sort of metabolism. And so I shall turn to the obvious convergent example. That's right, you got it first time. I will look at the plants, because there are a number of plants which effectively use the same mechanism of keeping warm. These are some of the lilies in particular. And then in due course, I want to do other things like vocalize, and I will want to be able to speak, so I will go to the birds, and we'll come back to that perhaps later on to show the similarities, not quite as precise as some people would like, and so on and so forth. So, the argument would be that we're ultimately going to end up in a Earth-like planet with a encephalized, tactile, visual, walking species that can speak. And we'll have lots of other things, by the way. Don't worry. Then, we'll keep the bacteria, because otherwise we'd all be dead. And we'll have an increasingly complex biosphere. And by and large, the geological record, I think, suggests that the Cretaceous was very interesting. This is the time before the asteroid hit. And a good part of the heavy lifting, which gives us our modern world, things like rainforests and mammals, are already well in position. But other things have to happen afterwards. But without going into all the technicalities, the biosphere today, or at least in living memory, was probably the most complex which has ever been seen. So in a certain sense, we did literally walk into an Eden. It was a marvelous place, and there we were.
Yes, that's a good summary of it. And let me just see if I get this straight. So it seems to me this convergence is being driven by more fundamental principles of physics, chemistry, the gravitational pull of the planet, the temperature, the air pressure, the medium, how thick the water is going to determine what kind of body you have. So, for example, you have a convergence of a fusiform body. So if you want to slip through water at the density that we have in our oceans, you need a body that's kind of streamlined, and the head is at one end, and you have kind of a narrow neck and then a wide body and then some kind of flipper. So whales, dolphins, the cetaceans, these are mammals, but their bodies are similar to fish because you have to have that. So those are convergent by, I think, analogy, right? Homologous convergence would be similar genetic relations, something like that.
Yeah, well, we can get diverted in that, and I've certainly got another 24 hours to cover the ground. But yes, approximately speaking, that's right. So I'm not trying to dismiss this point, because there are arguments which are perfectly interesting that a good part of the genetic architecture is, for instance, already available, and therefore when somebody develops a limb or an eye and so forth, by recruiting this existing genetic architecture, they are effectively showing a parallel evolution rather than what I would choose to call convergence. But I myself, I'm not trying to hide this stuff. I think it's something of a distraction, not least because, of course, we sometimes forget that when we're talking about people such as ourselves and organisms, I mean, something which I just find breathtaking is just their degree of coherence and organization. That thing works. It's amazing, hats off, that sort of thing.
But I mean,
correspondingly, when you mention the
if you strip off the flesh of a whale's flipper, it's a tetrapod forearm, right? It has the same bones that we have. And you go, oh, okay, it's not a fin like a fish. It's a fin like a arm that's been adapted because that's how evolution works. But my larger point is that doesn't feel like directionality or telos or design from the top down. That feels like that's just kind of the result of the physics and chemistry of the planet you happen to live on.
Well, that's true enough, except that the way I read it, but I have to explain immediately that I was actually talking to a mathematician at lunchtime in my college, and he was a delightful chap, but he absolutely terrified me because he said he's a specialist in geometry. And I thought, God, I don't know anything about that. So we got onto other subjects as quickly as possible. A very, very enjoyable, which is one of the lovely things about working in Cambridge. But the point there is that the total number of theoretical combinations of, if you want to mix things in any number you like, is so stupidly large. As I mentioned in passing in a couple of places, it's the astronomers and the cosmologists who deal with a small change. 10 to the 91 particles in a visible years. What the heck's that? That's nothing. In terms of biology, there are these so-called immense numbers. And my thesis, in a way, is just metaphorically speaking, if you imagine of a sort of a hyperspace of all possibilities, then the number of alternatives is so stupidly large that, in principle, a la Gould, the likelihood of ending up at anything like a terrestrial biosphere on the Earth is vanishingly small. Yet, at least on this planet, again and again and again. I was just actually doing I've got to write a quick essay for a colleague, and I was looking at the saber-tooth. And this is a classic example of convergence in the cats and a corresponding marsupial in South America. So that's all well, and I was sort of up to speed with that. But I did a bit more delving, and that's one of the lovely things about, getting so much information so quickly. And it turns out, not only do you get saber-tooth in various sorts of fish and frog, and that's okay, they're vertebrates, they're allowed on the plot, but you also get a remarkable one in a beetle, for goodness sake. So it's got this mandible at the front of the thing with a great big sort of things coming down like that. And it's not a saber-toothed cat, but as you say, I mean, if you're going to go around stabbing things, why not have a saber? It's a very good idea. And because those things are so recurrent, my sense is that they provide a sort of, so to speak, a vademecum for any terrestrial-like planet. In the same way I've said often in the past, when Darwin, I think, arrived in South America, he was gobsmacked. Because to a degree, especially in that time, it's utterly, they're plants and so forth, utterly unfamiliar. But of course, you begin to probe into the deeper similarities. And I think you hinted at that, Michael, that if there's another layer of organization, which is, if you like, physics and chemistry and so forth, but that's only, I think, part of it. Then one's looking at something there which is ordering the world in a way analogous to the periodic table.
Right. So you mentioned like sci-fi movies. So I'm thinking of those in the 50s where they have, these giant insects the size of a house. That's not possible, right? That would be an example of constraint based on physics and the relationship of surface areas to volume and that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, I mean, there was some whopping great objects wandering around in the Carboniferous, the coal forest times, and I know there's some dragonflies with, wingspans of getting on for a meter. And when you remember that, in fact, the great majority of all animals, including mammals, are actually pretty small, big things are actually rather rare, and probably for good reasons, because, of course, they need, especially people like us, we need vast amount of resources to keep ourselves going.
Yeah.
And yes, there are elephants as well, but, any case, that's that. So as and when we find an extraterrestrial, we might get onto that in due course, because I regret to tell you we won't, but not in the way we expect. I'll put a small amount of money, maybe even 2 bottles of wine, no more than that they're going to be strikingly similar to ourselves and our planet.
Yes. Well, we're going to disagree on that because I follow the kind of Gould, Sagan, in Cosmos, Sagan famously portrayed these giant gas planets like Jupiter could have these kind of floater things that are just kind of sucking up hydrogen or whatever and consuming and getting their energy that way. He didn't want to show terrestrial-like objects, or in Contact, he famously didn't show what the aliens look like because he didn't want to contaminate it with Hollywood wardrobe restrictions. And you're arguing something different than that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I did chase up a bit of Sagan's thinking on that, and I understand, but I'll be corrected straight away that actually the atmosphere is far too turbulent to allow that sort of thing to happen. But let that pass. But in a slightly parallel way, there's an ongoing discussion about the habitability of the cloud deck in Venus, and there's been a lot of toing and froing in the last few months, and we don't have to get distracted on that. But I mean, I love this because my instinct is that there isn't any life there, but there are a few strands of evidence which are very, very tantalizing and may yet turn out to be, But of course, the trouble is Venus and Earth are very close, and so it's not inconceivable. There's what we call a panspermia, that microbes conceivably could migrate more easy, I think, from Venus because of the solar wind to the Earth. But, we'll see what happens.
You mean then from Mars to Earth?
Oh, well, Mars, of course, there the story goes, because we know there are Martian meteorites. Because the Venusian atmosphere is so thick, it's basically impossible to get anything off the surface. It's as dense as a kilometre of seawater. But Mars is an easier take because it's a much smaller planet. And we've got, I think, several hundred Martian meteorites. And there is a suggestion that because Mars was more benign while the Earth was being pounded to pieces early in the history of the solar system, that it was a lump of Martian rock with microbes in it, which landed in that warm little pond which Darwin wanted, and just said, "Oh, this is right. Let's stay here." And we'll still see. But so far, Mars looks pretty quiet.
It does, yes. Well, but that just pushes back the causal chain to somewhere else to explain the origins of life. But so in your bigger picture you just gave us, yes, I'd like a nervous system, and being warm-blooded would be nice, and having a nervous system and a big brain would be even better, and so on. But most organisms on Earth survive just fine without any of that. I mean, there's plenty of reptiles, the deep hot biosphere, all the bacteria. Sharks, they're not becoming anything. They're pretty much the same way they've been for, 100 million years or whatever it is. And, they're doing quite well. They're not becoming anything, right? They're not becoming better sharks or smarter sharks. And it's better to have just a tiny little brain because you don't need much energy to run it.
No, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that, and in a certain sort of way. Of course, the irony is that we might also get onto that. We're the only people who know this. We're the only people with the vaguest interest in the fact that their sharks have or have not changed. But what one, as I hinted a few minutes ago, what does seem to be the case is that the degree of ecological complexity, the degree of ecological interactions, really has significantly increased through geological time. And this is something which involves, for instance, if you look at the plants and the so-called mycorrhizae, which are sort of fungal association related to that, or the way that insects can actually obtain what we would regard as impossible food sources like water in a plant, and so on and so forth. Those things, some of those we can show from molecular clocks and so forth, are relatively recent. So it's not, as you say, it's not with sort of going around saying, oh, well, everything's got to be evolving towards ourselves. All one would say is that, especially amongst the mammals and the birds, and you could argue each one of those is ultimately an evolutionary fluke. But we know the birds come from the dinosaurs. We know pretty clearly where we came from a little bit earlier, more or less in the Permian. But these are creatures there which do show a propensity to get smart. And it comes with costs. And there's no suggestion that somebody wants us to be smart. They might. That's another story. But yes, you're absolutely right. But certainly we don't want to try and corral the whole conversation into, why we are here. I mean, we can have that conversation, but from the biological perspective, we should be as interested in the way in which the envelopes have been filled. And as I argue in this new book, I would suggest that in point of fact, in terms of biological organisms, we're pretty close to the limits now of what can be done. We've got there to a large extent. There's maybe a little bit of movement, but if you look especially at the symbiotic associations where you've got two or three, say bacteria or something else, cooperating with an animal, there are upper limits to what you can manage. If you look at cell size, there's a limit to how small you can get. And all of those seem to have been reached.
You mean, for example,
and here we are, saying, well,
our brains can't really get any bigger because of the limitation of the skull passing through the pelvis opening in the female for birth, unless you just shifted to some other kind of just all cesarean births or something.
Well, there's a fairly horrifying prospect, but in point of fact, I mean, the way things are going, and actually given the number of cesarean sections now done, which I don't think they're yet a majority, but they're very, very frequent, including recently my daughter-in-law, for instance. That's all lovely, beautiful boy, and the rest of it. But the point, there's a more fundamental point there, I'm not good at remembering names, but because the brain, and I simplify here, and the reason I simplify is because I only just know what I'm talking about. But that the brain is sort of made of grey matter and white matter. And the rates of increase in terms of relative growth during the development of an individual are not identical. And I'd have to get out the references, some of them right behind me, in fact. But what we call the allometry, the relative growth rates of white and grey matter are such that our brains could not get bigger than about 3 times their present size without, just basically collapsing, and a number of other sort of constraints on this. So you're quite right. The birth canal is, the constraint as far as we're concerned. And of course, another thing about being a biologist, I think, is that maybe Cambridge academics are too naughty here, is not to get used to things, not to take things for granted. And in point of fact, if you look at a human from one perspective, we're absolutely monstrous because we have these colossal heads, gigantic thing, giant. And when I used to teach, you do the allometry of a child, which of course we love and adore. But if you look at it from another perspective, there's a tiny stump of a body with this colossal head on the top. And then, of course, as we grow into adulthood, the body gets bigger and the head gets proportionally smaller. But again, that may not matter because in a way, again, we might get onto the conversation. Of course, we in a certain sense, what our brains can do already is so phenomenal in terms of understanding things and all the rest of it. That in a way, probably not much virtue in, spending. I hope you've, as a true American, I hope you've had your breakfast and I had lunch, and at least 25% of my lunch is going to feed my brain. It's a very hungry thing up there.
Right. So again, let me come at it a slightly different way. If all these characteristics were so adaptive, how come there are hardly any big brain animals, and we're the only one with a massive brain? I suspect you're going to come in with maybe some directionality from the outside there, but again,
and if you like,
sometimes I'll read a paleoanthropological paper and it talks about like this tooth is almost a modern tooth, or Lucy is like almost bipedal. She's on her way to becoming bipedal, is kind of the implications of the language. It's like, no, Lucy wasn't on the way to becoming anything. Lucy was a perfectly well adapted Australopithecine doing what she does, and she's not becoming anything. And that's because evolution's not looking in any direction. And, Dawkins makes the point that at no point in history did I think the analogy was a Homo erectus mother ever give birth to a Homo sapien baby. That's just not how it works. So that would get you have a chapter on myths of missing links. So there,
it would.
Yeah.
Well, of course, in many ways, I agree. There's one of the counterfactual novels. I hope I've got the title right. I think it's called A Different Flesh by Harry Turtledove. And I hope this doesn't take too long to explain, but in a sense, it's a thought experiment supposing the Americas, where you're sitting, had not been colonized by Homo sapiens, which actually for various reasons is extremely unlikely. But then if you can get to Easter Island, you can certainly get to North America. But in any event, supposing that there's something similar to Lucy waiting on the shores as the Europeans arrive. So what happens when you basically telescope 3 million years of history? And it doesn't turn out too well, I'm afraid. It's not a happy story by and large. But it's very moving and very sort of fascinating. And you've got to be so careful here because, of course, behind some of the Darwinian thinking, there is this sort of idea of superiorities and so forth. This is a total minefield, I mean, it's such a... And again, going back to what Gould was thinking about genocides in Europe at that time. So I don't want to go into that area at all. And as you say, who knows what the cognitive powers of Lucy were, but one can be pretty sure, even though her brain was only marginally larger than a chimpanzee, that the tools these people are beginning to make very shortly afterwards are notably different from anything a chimpanzee does. It's different. Something has happened to them, and a whole set of standard explanations. That's perfectly right. And that trajectory, because yes, indeed, Lucy's sitting there, and he's probably spending more time in the trees than on the ground. I don't know where the current debate there is. But and of course, as you say, as Robert Foley and others have pointed out, it's a bush of homonym evolution. Yeah. It's not a linear thing.
Right.
But interestingly, for better or worse, unlike most clades of mammals, there's only one species left, and guess who they are?
The ones writing the story. Yes. So let me just make one last point on this. I think this idea of directionality depends on the level of analysis. If you're talking about the huge picture, the entire history of life, you can certainly make the arguments that you made earlier. But if you just take just a single snapshot of time, again, Lucy's not becoming anything. The species are just doing what they do to survive, and they're perfectly well adapted at that particular time. So to get your argument going, you need to kind of take a 35,000 foot view of the whole thing, or a deep time view, and look at the big picture that way, and then the question becomes, well, do you think that the laws of nature have built into them some kind of like impetus pushing, like an Aristotelian argument for the arrow is shot and it's an impetus pushing it, as opposed to a Newtonian thing? Do the laws of nature have front loaded into them, that there's a kind of directionality? You're going to get, big brains and nervous system, a big brain, warm bloodedness, and so on and so forth. Tool use eventually, that kind of thing. Is that your sense of what you think happened?
You could write that in. I wouldn't have a particular quarrel with it, and it's not quite the same point, but it's fairly clear, I believe, that in regard to sort of biological developments in the embryo, for example, there is this sort of self-organization in a certain way. It's a sort of embryo obviously needs genetic information, but a good part of it is making itself. And one assumes, it's not my area at all. Well, nothing's my area these days. I'm too shallow. But, that this self-organization is reflecting in a way that there's a very distinguished biologist called Darcy Thompson, fascinating man in many respects. And he sort of, in a way, saw a geometry of life and more interested in that sort of arrangement. And it was very unrelated, but a Soviet biologist called Vavilov, who had a very sad end in Stalin's time. But they're looking there at a deeper organizational principle. So you're from a 35,000 feet perspective, there may be grander patterns. And again, you've got to be so careful because, these things in history, human history, are repeatedly hijacked in a way which can be very, very worrying indeed. So it's not I'm nervous about it, but, I wouldn't want to make excessive claims. And I can fully understand, Michael, you're gently probing me on directionality. You've dropped a couple of hints that perhaps the old boy in Cambridge has actually got, some other theological agenda there. I better get that out in the open before too long. What otherwise, that'd be a pointless interview. Right? But,
Sure, do tell.
I don't know, who can say? But any one of those things, they can all be discussed. I'm not nervous about the discussion on them, but I am wary about taking scientific evidence into metaphysical areas unless one is extremely careful, and you've got a really good group of sappers with you, which can detect intellectual minds.
You're too funny. Well, I do want to probe those, but let's table that for just a moment, because your argument for convergent evolution, when I read Life Solutions, to me, it felt like a really fabulous argument for that there must be intelligent life all over the cosmos. And now, with the Kepler telescope and so on, it looks like every star has planets, and there might be as many as 1 trillion galaxies. So, you have 100 billion stars in each galaxy, 1 trillion galaxies, or whatever it is, just a massively large number. And so even if you take the Drake equation and you just put a tiny fraction for each of the steps that has to come to fruition, there's just so many places for this to be. And that with your arguments for convergent evolution, you're just bound to get something like a tool-using primate that has a big brain and can communicate with radio or build spaceships or self-replicating robot ships or AI or whatever. That just seems to happen. And yet you're making a different conclusion, that we're probably alone, right?
Oh, no.
How do you get there from your own theory of convergence?
Yeah, well, I know. I've gone and dug myself a very deep hole, haven't I?
It feels like it.
Actually, as I prefer to put it, I don't mind that too much, as long as I can see the daylight. Or I've actually got a paradox on the way, or in fact, as I think I mentioned in the new book, this quote by Emil Dubois, I approximate, I really like your theory, but it's absolutely crazy. There's only one thing wrong with it. It's not crazy enough.
Right.
And of course, they're dealing with areas which are far beyond my pay scale. But in essence, yes, I would suggest that given a number of planets, as you say, and even though a tiny fraction will be Earth-like in any way of habitable zone and having plate tectonics and oxygenated atmosphere, even so, that number is stupidly large. Mm-hmm. That is, that's the night sky for you. There all is. And there are a number of reasons for not my skepticism, but my sort of, if you like, my concern. This has been pointed out by a whole set of other people, because as ever, this is not my own research course. But in essence, the universe is 13-point-something billion years old, give or take. That of course, is a scientific hypothesis. It could change, but it looks okay at the moment. And the first solar systems are forming about 1 billion years later. Solar systems similar to our solar system, I I'm led to believe, are forming around about 8 billion years ago. Now, the snag is that our solar system is 4.5 billion years old, so it's relatively young. And solar systems are forming at the present day, as we know, when you look at nebulae and all that sort of business. So if indeed there are intelligent species which decide to go on a galactic diaspora, as we call it, they decide to go on holiday across the star systems, then they've got a head start of probably 2 billion years. And as I've written elsewhere, I mean, what happens is we're back in the Cambrian, we're back in the Burgess Shale. Down comes a spaceship, it's a pretty hot day as usual, and they see these small sort of, sardine-like creatures in the lagoon. And because they're like me and they really enjoy trying new food, they say, well, let's have a go at these. And, somebody goes back to the fridge and gets out the Chablis or whatever. And that's us, the ancestors, being toasted. And, we wouldn't be here. And that is, there are all sorts of let-out clauses here, like you're not allowed to eat the indigenous fauna, or you're not allowed to leave footprints, blah-de-blah-de-blah. But that something there just seems not to add up. And there are several escape clauses. One is the origin of life is fantastically improbable. The second one, which will bring smiles and cheers to some of your leaders, Conway Morris, is completely wrong. There we go. Convergence is just a local phenomena. Or alternatively, in point of fact, what happens as we evolve in some pretty unclear way means that maybe the Milky Way and beyond is hooching with aliens, but we've no idea what we're looking for. And this is science fiction, okay? Or alternatively, as we hope very much will not happen in the coming weeks, there's a catastrophic nuclear exchange, or there's catastrophic global warming. Take your choice, and so on and so. But as you say, the fact that there are so many planetary systems, and a little bit of the thing is that I'm sure you're familiar with this concept of the so-called Dyson Sphere, which is the idea that as you need more and more energy, you trap the sunlight, and ultimately your solar system appears as an infrared object because so much of your energy is being taken up by the civilization and re-radiated as waste heat. And from an astronomical viewpoint, because infrared detection is one of their skills, you could look for Dyson spheres as being anomalously red. And they've done that the Milky Way is a big place, but so far without success. But beyond that, there is a suggestion, which is not completely mad, that even a whole galaxy could be turned into a Dyson sphere. And the advantage there is you can look at an awful lot of galaxies, and indeed these studies have been done, and so far I believe nothing. I mean, yes, some anomalous ones have been found, but in no case do they seem to represent a technology. So this, again, it just gives me pause for thought. I mean, Enrico Fermi's famous paradox, where are they? Could somebody tell me where they're hiding? And there's this book by Stephen Webb, which I mentioned. I think it's a wonderful read, and he's got something like 72 different explanations. But I think he concludes, well, there's something here doesn't add up.
Right. Well, of course, the ufologists think they are here, but we'll set that aside for the moment. Yeah. So
we could get on that.
Those listeners not familiar with the Fermi paradox of where is everybody, let me just articulate this. So applying the Copernican principle that we're not special, we're in the middle of the bell curve. We're likely not the very first technological communicating intelligent species. So there must be those ahead of us. And I think by your calculations, you could explore the entire Milky Way galaxy in like 100 million years. And we're only 4.5 billion years old. You could add somebody that's billions of years ahead of us. They've had plenty of time, even if they're making just self-replicating robots, or they're just sending out AI computers or whatever. It doesn't have to be biological intelligence. We should have a signal for them by now. By the way, Avi Loeb at Harvard, I'm part of his Galileo project team. I don't know if you followed that, the Oumuamua guy. Now, I'm pretty skeptical that Oumuamua is a artifact of an extraterrestrial civilization, but he makes the point that, well, we won't know if we don't look, so he's raising money to build these cameras to look. Okay, good. I'm all for it.
Good luck to him. I think it's terrific.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if I follow you correctly, there's just too many bottlenecks to come along to get from, say, bacterial grade life to multicellular eukaryotic life to complex organisms like ourselves to all the way to Neanderthals. I mean, if you just run the counterfactual and there's no Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals have the run of Europe, which they did for several 100,000 years by themselves. They weren't becoming on the road to us, or were they? I mean, I know this is kind of a debatable point. What do you think on that?
Well, who knows? I mean, it's fascinating. Again, nobody can be completely up to date. So, whenever you sort of say something, you get a very polite email saying, "Why don't you read my papers?" So,
Yes,
sorry.
right.
But in essence, there is an argument that, well, first of all, it's not entirely clear when Homo sapiens arrives in Europe. It may be a bit earlier than we thought. That's recent. But more particularly, it's fairly clear the Neanderthals undergo a sort of cultural revolution, which is epitomized from localities in France. One of them is known as Chateauperon. So the so-called Chateauperonian culture. And again, I apologise to the many archaeologists because they'll always say, "Oh, no, it's not. That's much more complicated than that." But there are other locations in sort of Croatia and nearby countries there, and what it seems to be the case is that the Neanderthals caught lots of birds, and that makes perfectly good sense because they're delicious. Well, most people think they are. But they also caught large raptors, eagles, and so forth. And I have on good authority, even though apparently an eagle was cooked in wartime London, they're pretty ghastly to eat. It tells you more about wartime London than anything else. So these have got these superb feathers, and you can look at the wing bones, and there are these little marks where the flint has cut the feathers away. It's a wonderful piece of Sherlock Holmes archaeology. It's just super. And the likelihood is that they're not making down mattresses or anything like that. They're using these feathers for display. And we know, of course, in many societies, I believe the Hawaiian Islands and New Zealand and places like that, feathers are, and of course the Great Plain Indians as well. And so if they've got a feather and they're using it for ornamentation or shamanism, who knows, but the point is that they're entering a symbolic universe. They're conveying information which is understandable to that other species. And the dog, I don't think they had dogs, but let's pretend they had dogs. Oh, maybe they did. There's another story there. Has not a clue why they're putting feathers around their head. It's not of any interest to a dog. Dog just wants dinner. At least my dog does. So that seems to have occurred independently of the Homo sapiens. And their brain size is actually slightly different. And they're a fascinating, one thing, not to take you to too many tangents, but one of the fascinating things is apparently if you look at the bones, what the so-called middens, the sort of animals Neanderthals and Homo sapiens eat, they're pretty much the same thing. They're very fond of horse and deer, and if they could get it, a bit of elephant, thank you very much. But when you look at the small mammals which provide the fur to keep the cold away, things like stoat in particular, there's plenty in Homo sapiens, but almost nothing in the Neanderthals. We know Neanderthals had clothing. There's a very elegant way you can demonstrate that, even though they're not preserved. But they don't seem to have the way you associate with an Inuit, where you've got this sort of, parka, which keeps the frostbite at bay. So there's something there, not quite human, perhaps, but they do seem to be on the same trajectory. But you're quite right. I mean, going back to turtle doves thing, supposing the Neanderthals had taken over, I don't think it would have been very much different. It would have taken a bit longer, perhaps, but, they're probably much the same. Yes. And of course, most, not all of us, but you and I, have got Neanderthal DNA in
well, we do. Yes, we got our 2%.
Absolutely.
But so, and
don't feel left out if you don't have Neanderthal. You've got other DNA. It's quite all right. You're not excluded.
That's right. Yeah. So let's rewind the tape a little further. Take Neanderthals out. It's not Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. It's Homo erectus, and they have the run of Eurasia for a million years. Do you think they would have then developed culture and symbolic communication and it would be two Homo erectus having this conversation now?
With respect, I don't think that's. I don't want to sound rude at all. I don't think that's quite the question. I mean, all one has to say is you've got an evolutionary lineage which has a propensity to increasing bipedality, certainly significant changes in tool use, and probably, it depends on what timescale you want to use, around about at least 300,000 years ago, they're beginning to use this red pigment known as ochre. And that's actually got a whole set of functions like that. So I'm reasonably happy to sort of imagine a gradualistic change. And I can believe that as the populations got larger, and in particular when different groups began to interact, then this, of course, may have led to warfare. I don't think we've got any direct evidence. But of course, it also leads to cultural enrichment. Because you say, God, that's a jolly good idea. I never knew you could cook a shellfish that way. Well, let's give that one a go, shall we? And so on and so forth. So it's not as if, unless somehow that lineage was to be, quote, terminated, there is a fairly persistent trend of what we call encephalization, increase in the brain size. And equally, with regards to manipulability and other things. And again, it's not a one-way story. I mean, there's the amazing fossils from South Africa, which are sort of probably only about 200, 300,000 years old. And they show this fantastic combination of rather archaic things, which go way, way back in time, to other ones which are surprisingly modern. But actually, again, in the grand schemes of things, we're back at 35,000 feet, okay? One of the fascinating things about evolution is that it's, if you like, modular. And one thing which interests me quite a lot is what we call Mosaic Evolution. That is, you can combine different things, some which are rather advanced, some which are rather primitive. And so you can tinker and experiment in all sorts of different ways. And of course, the majority probably won't give you the pay dirt, but sooner or later somebody will do that. And we see this throughout the fossil record. We see it with the colonization of land by creatures ultimately will become frogs and ultimately us. We see it with the ascent into air by the birds. There are lots and lots, all independently, pretty well going in the same direction. And, some of them probably go back onto the ground in the case of the birds and become flightless. That's quite all right. You're allowed to do that. So I wouldn't want to sort of say, until we are here and we're having this conversation. And from my perspective, I mean, obviously, I'm wholly constrained by my biology in terms of reproduction and breathing and death and all the rest of it. But as you can see behind me and with your picture behind you, that all bets are off.
Yes, indeed. So just to close the book on extraterrestrials, your sense is that the current absence of evidence is evidence of absence. They're just not out there.
Well, I'm going to put another bottle of claret on that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's I don't mind being proved wrong at all. I have been repeatedly, but in a way which I hope is meant to be positive. I'm trying to provoke, but I'm by no means alone in these speculations. I'm drawing on other people's work. I'm not an astronomer, but I'm fascinated in this possibility that we are alone. I mean, it does seem ridiculous. But as I say, it's not as if there aren't some lines of evidence which are rather discouraging.
Yes. I know the literature pretty well. I remember Peter Ward's book, Rare Earth, and he made the argument. Here's like a dozen reasons why we're probably alone. Stuff I'd never even thought of, like where in the galaxy our solar system is located, and how many metal stars there are, and all that kind of stuff. And yet, you read the SETI literature, not the UFO stuff, the real serious stuff. And you get, positions from like, it's 100%, virtually one. I think there was a book called, one, probability of one or something like that. It's 100% that they're out there. To, rare earth and, next to no chance that they're out there. So it seems to me, just kind of epistemologically or kind of a philosophy of science perspective that, where we just don't know. We're so early in the game of looking that, you can fill in those Drake equation components with almost anything you want, and you end up with 100,000 civilizations in the Milky Way alone, to 1,000, to 10. Well, there's only one. Okay, and then it's almost science fiction. We'll just make up whatever you want.
No, I agree, but the very fact we don't know, I'm not to sound ludicrously pompous about this, but to a large extent, that's why, if I am a scientist, I sometimes wonder, I must say, but, that's why one is a scientist. Stuff which is known is great because, you might have made a small contribution there, but, and of course, we're coming into areas where, there's a whole set of opinions. I mean, obviously, I'm going to mention the dreadful C word now. I've said it, consciousness, shush. But those sorts of things, really, well, if you want to.
Well, to me, I've had a bunch of the consciousness people on the podcast. I just had David Chalmers on, and I don't think we released that one. We're recording this on March 8th. Yeah, and I'm about to have Anil Seth on. Here's his argument. Anil Seth, I like his argument that this entire discussion of consciousness, mind, what is it? Dualism, monism, all that stuff. He said this is like a century ago when biologists talked about the elan vital. What's the magic formula for life. And eventually it just goes away because you've explained how each of the physiological processes work in the different organs and so on. And at some point you just stop asking, is there a elan vital? And so his sense is that we won't be talking about consciousness. We'll just understand it once we know all the neural networks or whatever the explanation is going to be. What do you think about that?
Well, good luck.
Good luck. You think it's a much harder problem than life?
I don't hold any quarrel with it. Of course not. I mean, but there are a few promissory notes to suggest that might not be going to get as far as we'd like. And you're absolutely right, of course, about the so-called Emil Dubois and Bergson and people like that. But of course, sometimes I've just came across a German I should have known about years ago, who was contemporary of Ernst Haeckel, who was Darwin's great fan in Germany. And this is a guy called Emil Dubois Raymond. And he was a very distinguished physiologist. And this is such a delight because, I didn't know about this guy. Well, I knew a tiny bit about him, but, I suddenly found a treasure trove of stuff, people talking about him. And he had this sort of thing. There are just some things he just I can imagine him sort of, banging his finger like this and saying, we will never know. It's simply beyond what we can understand. Now, scientists don't like that sort of thing, and Haeckel in particular got very upset about this. And so oddly enough did the German government, but that's another story. But what I'm trying to mention in this book, and the thing I think, which as I mentioned, cat among pigeons, is that I'm profoundly interested in the fact that we're no longer animals. In other words, there is this, what has been called the gap, to use a chap called Thomas Sudendorf. There is... animals do all sorts of clever and intelligent things, and yes, we know all about this, but they don't speak, they don't have language, and of course there are anthropologists who will tell both of us what actually happened, and there'll be linguists as well. And they make tools, but by and large they don't use one tool to make another tool, and then they don't teach. They learn, of course they do. They memorize, but do they actually remember the time as an episode? And this whole long string of things. Again, I'm not being provocative because I wish to be provocative. But what is fascinating is that, as you say, with any one of these areas, it's not so much that there's opposing sides, but there's an undercurrent of uncertainty. That people feel that somehow this isn't quite adding up in a way, like the Fermi paradox. Something here is, we're missing a point on this. And of course, most people say, well, it's a bigger brain, or genetic changes, or social complexity. And these are sufficient to explain why you and I can talk to each other. But if I had a dog here, he wouldn't have a clue what we're talking about. He would know lots of things, of course, and he'd have emotions and all the rest of it. And that, I think, will be, as I recklessly suggest in the book, that there may be an escape clause there, that perhaps, and I suspect Michael Shermer will not agree. That
all right,
actually,
give it to us. What's the escape clause?
I hope he doesn't. Oh yeah, I'll give you that. All right, okay. That actually, the universe, to put it in a cliche, is very, very different from what we think it is. I mean, it's, as you say, it's early days of just about everything. But I'm very fascinated in the sort of people who just regard it as a hairline difference between a chimpanzee or a crow, which are both cognitively capable, and the human, plus the fact we know we came from the primates, plus the fact we have a fossil record, as we've been discussing, with Erectus and Neanderthals and all that sort of stuff. But despite that, I mean, it seems to me that speech is a rather useful thing, and we know that animals vocalize. So, you would expect that to be under some degree of selection pressure. It's very helpful if, the chimpanzee beside you says, for God's sake, get it out of my way. There are two leopards coming towards us. Now, they can give alarm calls and all the rest of it. Of course they can. But what they can't do, and this is perhaps going off at too much of a tangent, and this is disputed, of course, naturally, as is right and proper, is what they can't do is, well, they can't stand in each other's shoes. They can never be actors. They can be mimics, but the theory of mind, as you say. And again, this is it's not a minefield, but I've been reading partly in anticipation of the interview, trying to catch up with a little bit of the stuff there. But I think there's something of a sea change going on amongst the people who've been looking especially at the way the crows and their cognitive capacity to remember what they call caching, where they leave their bits of food for the winter, all over the place, and correspondingly, this theory of mind, and again, this is simplifying. I'm aware of this so-called where, what, when thing. Not only did you remember where you put it, but when did you put it there? And in point of fact, I think you hinted early on. I mean, the animals don't need to know this. I mean, it's not. They need to know where their chow comes from, but they don't need to spend their time with complex grammars and language. So most people say, no, it's okay. You're just exaggerating these differences. But I'm thinking otherwise.
No, I agree with you. I think the gap is real. I've followed the animal language debates for decades. I was at one of those TED conferences where I think, was it Penny Patterson spoke? It was, I think, the Coco, the gorilla trainer. I think that was her. And she's showing a video of where the gorilla is signing something, and you can clearly see this incredible thing. It's like, I don't really clearly see anything. It seems to me you're kind of reading into what the pattern you think is there,
Sure.
And if you just showed the video to somebody who didn't know what you know, are they going to go, oh yeah, he's thinking cognitive? No, I'm pretty skeptical. I think the gap is real. It's huge. But if you take some concept like Dan Dennett's degrees of freedom in his book, Freedom Evolves, he argues for the compatibilist free will position there, that you scale up from simple to complex organisms and the degrees of freedom increases. There's still a gap, but there is a kind of a continuum amongst the animals all the way up to, say, chimps. And then you have this gigantic gap to us, and you have the hominid fossil remains, and we're the last one standing. Maybe there was a dozen or two bipedal primates with larger brains than chimps, Homo erectus and up to Neanderthals, which are bigger than ours. So wouldn't the argument just be, if you just have layers and layers and layers of more cortex than the chimp, you're just going to scale up with more degrees of freedom, and at some point you get maps of the body on top of maps. So this is Damasio, Antonio Damasio's argument that it's maps and maps and maps, and at some point just self-awareness comes online because the map is aware of all the other maps, something like that. And so you get the red dot test. You put the red dot on the chimp's forehead and put him in front of a mirror,
sure.
and he goes,
yeah.
And I'm always a little skeptical of what that actually means, but that's kind of he's self-aware. I don't know anyway, give us your thoughts on that kind of scaling up. There is a gap, but still there's kind of a continuum, sort of.
Well, in a way, from one perspective, there must be a continuum, obviously, just paleontologically. And indeed, any one of these explanations, and there are a whole set which are sort of parallel in one way or another. I mean, each one is equally convincing, and I think each one is untestable. I mean, it's. I wouldn't be so rude as to say they're just so stories, but yeah, because we can't, in a sense, we can never ask the chimpanzee what they're thinking, regrettably. But more particularly, and again, I entirely. Well, I wouldn't say there's not a question of sympathy with this, because only we can sympathise. That's another story. But you talk about the mirror test, okay, where you put a red dot or something on an elephant or something, and then you show them the mirror. And of course, in an elephant, you need a mirror of enormous size. And sure enough, dolphins, some chimpanzees, some birds, not all, and they start flapping around and saying something there. The curious thing I came across the other day is, and this is something which again tells us much more about ourselves and about the animals, is that practically without exception, these so-called mirror self-recognition, I believe this is the case, are actually in animals which are what we call enculturated. In other words, they're animals which have spent all their time with humans. And so the first problem,
right,
in my view, is if you start using enculturated animals, I wouldn't go so far as to say you're wasting your time, but you've got to have a big health warning on this. And I do remember going out to Madingley, where Nicky Clayton works, and we were doing a little bit of television there many years ago. And my starring role, rather implausibly in an aviary, was to bring out an octopus for Convergent Evolution, but that's what I was paid to do. But I was just fascinated to see the way the assistants and the people were just playing with the crows. They spent all their time, as if you have pets of any description, spend the entire time talking to them. And I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. So the fact of the matter is, by and large, when you're in the jungle, you do not see chimpanzee pretending to be Narcissus. You're not looking at in the pool and saying, "I'm a handsome chap," God, yeah, etc., etc. The other thing, which in a sense is not going to change other people's minds, but something struck me remarkably, which I hadn't fully appreciated, is that Of course, you can't say to the animal, unless they're enculturated. Some have, as you say, like Coco, they've got sign language, but you say, well, all right, okay, if you say it's sign language, we don't mind. It probably is. Is you've got to train them. And the time it takes. And then you sort of think, well, are you actually training the animal, or are you producing a circus trick?
Mm-hmm.
And there can be sometimes 50,000 trials. 50,000 trials.
That's a Skinnerian
and what that tells me is something yes, exactly. It tells me something really important. It tells us nothing much about the animals. It tells us everything about ourselves. But what other species would actually want to spend a whole year trying to persuade this starling or the chimpanzee or the bonobo, whatever your favorite example is, to get these things right? And then, the trouble, these animals, I'm simplifying enormously, but they're pretty well one-trick ponies. They might be terribly good at one thing, but they're not terribly good at exporting it. And, as you say, poor old Conway Morris, he's just stuck in a circularity. We know we're different. That's not a debate. It's a bigger brain, not a debate. So where's the debate? I think it's because there's something genuine there. As you say, I'm pleased in a way to hear you say this. There is this very profound gap. And I think it is because effectively, in contrast to the received wisdom with regard to consciousness and the mind, is actually what we choose to call our consciousness, is something much, much odder than it's not a material. It's not entirely material. And one reason, listen to Conway Morris ranting on here. And you're probably looking for the off button at the moment. I don't blame you either.
Please. This is where I want to go. Go for
hours ago. It's terrible. Sorry. Again, there are other sort of things. One of the great thing about is you find you read all sorts of arcane literature. And one of these people who have various forms of so-called hydrocephaly, whereby they have massive amounts of their brain missing. And in a number of cases, these are actually surgery. They've had to have the operation. In other cases, they're born with them, and it's not a simple area at all. But there are some totally astonishing examples of people whose skulls have really got an awful lot of fluid and not very much brain tissue there. And yet they are, some of them are certainly cognitively challenged, to use the euphemism, but some of them are not. And you just think, what's going on here? And then it's a different story from a different angle. And I don't know, I can't even remember the exact term, but people, as unfortunately, many of us will, is in our last years, will have dementia. And that's, we all know people who have it and suffered from it, and it's ghastly. But what happens not infrequently, and you could say, well, this is because some protein is being fired up again, is they have this so-called terminal lucidity. Have you come across this thing called terminal lucidity? Yeah, so for the last couple of weeks, they suddenly, all their memories come back. And, they're almost as you remember him or her.
It's a weird thing, yeah.
And this tells me something. You could say, it's just a reorganization of the brain. It's a little bit like an out-of-body experience. It's just, getting things into final order, knowing that, the system is closing down pretty soon. But my perspective would be actually it is because what we call memory, what we call consciousness, is something which is, in a certain sense, extraterritorial.
So you're a dualist?
No. You see?
No? What?
Well, no, because it is in the same way as your elevator. The term dualism, a la 17th century thinking, isn't going to get us any further. You can put me in that compartment in as much as you say you've got a mind and a body, but I don't dispute we're completely embodied. But I also think, and this is what makes humans so utterly peculiar, is we have this capacity for abstract thinking, which I don't think animals do. In particular, we have this capacity, as I mentioned briefly in the book, for mathematics and language as well. And language isn't just strings of words. Language is totally cognitive. It's all about thought. And we would presume that, when we die, that's it, and that's a great shame, etc., etc. I don't know. I have a interest in the paranormal, but one can also put that entirely, you could, into areas of the delusional. It may well be. I try and keep an open mind in these sort of areas, but a little bit like the Fermi paradox, I have a few sort of hints and so forth that the story which has been used, not in any, as you say, dualistic fashion, is not going to get us very much further. And so, I'm trying to encourage some rethinking. But the animals provide a very useful foil to that.
Yes, and those are good examples. But
I can see you don't like it, but that's okay.
No, it's I like that. But if I said the mind is, the word mind is just a word we're using, a linguistic placeholder, to describe what the brain does, and we don't understand everything it does, and you have this kind of conceptual gap between the neural correlates of consciousness, like, patients in a coma or whatever, or just any of us actively engaged in perception, and you can measure the V1 area of the visual cortex and so forth, and say that's where red is located back here, and so on. But that's different from my experience of red, so-called qualia. And I'm not sure what the possible answer could be, because you're taking a conceptual leap. You're asking what it's like to be something, and I can't know that. I don't know what it's like to be my dog. He does. He doesn't know what it's like to be me, and that can never happen. The little homunculus in my head can never leap over into yours. I can only infer that you have feelings like I have feelings because I see clues about it and so on, and I'm not special, so you're probably similar to me, and so on. That's the best we could do. And so at this point, I'm wondering, are you going to make the same kind of leap? Or are you making the same kind of leap that Alfred Russel Wallace did? I did my doctoral dissertation on him and wrote a biography of him. And he famously broke with Darwin, sort of, on the problem of our big brains. Why do we have aesthetic appreciation, mathematical reasoning? You don't need a brain this big to survive. Chimps do just fine, and so on. And he, so now he wasn't traditionally religious. He just thought there's something else going on here that kind of enters into the system somewhere in evolutionary history and gave us this big brain. And Darwin famously said, I hope you have not murdered your child and mine by taking natural selection too far. And this still remains something of a mystery. So is it at that point you are going to invoke something like a higher power or a intelligent designer? Although I've heard you say you're not an intelligent designer. No. So
no.
Just explain. So just take that. Well, where does mind come from? What is your explanation?
Well, but I mean, first of all, with regard to Wallace, I'm not very well acquainted. I should be, but I'm not I'm well aware of his interest in spiritualism and so forth. I've not read that widely, and I mean, slightly in parenthesis, very entertainingly, the Royal Society, I think it's several years ago, they suddenly twigged on it's some anniversary of the old boy coming up. And so they all started rushing around and have a conference. I'm not sure if the conference ever held, but never mind. And I was asked to look at the sort of, proposal. I don't think this is confidential. It's not very interesting in any case. But Wallace was involved with a number of sort of social issues in a way, partly because of his background and like, which Darwin wasn't. I mean, Darwin was a good man, but Wallace, in a sense, had a real social conscience about things like access to land, which, Sierra Club stuff almost on a very small scale. It's called Sheffield. But I pointed out, I said, look, there's no mention of this chap's interest in spiritualism. And then I said something rather rude about the Royal Society. I'm afraid, not very helpful at any rate. But in the august scientific bodies, this is an absolute no-no. You just don't go there. If you talk about it, you're just, clearly a sign of weakness. Do I sort of, what do I understand about mind? Well, articulation and language begin to fall apart at this stage, but actually they generally do, as T.S. Eliot pointed out in his famous poem, everything just struggling the entire time to articulate the stuff. And I can see why it is so difficult. And I'm quite influenced. There's a chap called Jeff Kripal, who I know a little bit, a friend, I think, and he gives a nice puff to the book as well. And he's in Rice University in Texas. Now, he's certainly got a particular interest in, if you like, the anthropology of the paranormal. He's written a whole set of books. And I think they're fascinating. But I mean, if I understand him correctly, he has, an interest in Philip K. Dick, which you mentioned in passing a little bit earlier. And also, I mean, to try and answer your question in a totally inadequate way, it is that, in a sense, echoing what other people have been saying, we're just going to lose interest in the word consciousness. Consciousness is something utterly, utterly different. Totally, utterly, And it can precede everything. It can precede the Big Bang, if you like. You can invoke God in it if you wish, but That's not compulsory. And again, I've got my own religious faith as well. But, and my critics would probably say, well, I'm being, driven by this. But to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that's actually the case. But
I don't get the sense, Simon, I don't get the sense that whatever your religious beliefs are, that they're driving your science. I don't get that sense from you. But do tell us. I mean, your books are published by the Templeton Press, the Templeton Foundation. I found some videos of you on this Test of Faith program. So somebody must think that your work supports the idea of a deity. Do you believe there's a God, a personal God, or a prime mover, or what? What do you, just tell us what you believe.
I do. No, I know I profess a Christian faith and so forth, but I've come to it probably as much in the way that C.S. Lewis did. I'm afraid, being an academic, it's an intellectual exercise, whereas I know other people are brought to that particular church through very different routes. Indeed, I'm whatever, but. That in a way is, in my country, in England, we have a variety of churches, of course, but in the Creed, you say on an 8 o'clock service, which is based on the Book of Common Prayer, which goes basically back to Tudor times and has got glorious language. In that Creed, we say all things visible and invisible. So to begin with, I'm perfectly relaxed. And indeed, no doubt people who work in CERN would be very happy to talk about things invisible as well, whatever their senses might tell them, and all the rest of it. But all I would say, not for apologetics or anything like that, that's not my game at all, I'm afraid, is that I'm perfectly happy to see congruences with that. But I'm certainly not arguing for proofs. But more particularly, I would actually say that, and I know Richard Dawkins has written in his God Delusion about this, perhaps not in a way I'd agree with, but I don't think there are any proofs for God at all in the same way as there isn't a proof for consciousness. I'm not equating them, because it's something completely other. And you can see an intermeshing, and of course the Christianity makes very specific arguments in that direction, which most people would find these days incredible, but when let all that pass. But the thing again, what I say in the book, without over promoting it, is that on the chapter about animal minds, right at the beginning, I give a long list of the species names of Homo sapiens. And of course, there are all sorts, there's Homo economicus, there's Homo sovieticus, but also there's Homo naran. We're the storytellers. We find ourselves in a story. And that's sort of trying to go back sort of full circle to Philip K. Dick. And he was, I've read his biographies, a very strange and remarkable man. And you could say that, people who take intoxicants or drugs or something else that do change their minds, and perhaps that's to their disadvantage. And I'm not saying he's a drug addict or anything like that. I don't know. I'm not terribly interested, frankly. I enjoy alcohol enormously, as my wife would confirm. But the point there is that, as he said, we are the written, and we are the writers, and we are the written. We're in a thing where we, in a sense, and you could take this from an agnostic viewpoint, I think, and simply say that we make our own worlds.
So the Christian,
and science, of course, is part of that.
Yeah, so the Christian story is a powerful one, and you accept that one. Why do you accept that one and not the Jewish story, the Islam story, the Buddhist story, the whatever? What makes that story more compelling? If we think about, knowledge is justified true belief, what is your justification for being a Christian? So if you're a Christian, you believe that Jesus died, was resurrected, and then the theological arguments, died for our sins and so forth. But let's just make a Humean argument that 100 billion people have lived and died before us. Not one of them has come back from the dead, except for maybe one. So it's 100 billion to one that Jesus actually did this. And so the argument. Well, at some point, do you say, yes, I think that's what happened, or do you say it's not? I'm not even making the argument. I just believe based on faith, and it's a different category than science, or what?
Probably one would call it a different category, if that's helpful. And clearly, if I'm brought up in this country and with the parents I had and so forth, I'm more likely to have ended up. Most of my colleagues, I think, are agnostics or even atheists. I think that's pretty well the case. But there we are. I'm not. Again, I don't want to engage in apologetics because I'm not the apologist. But
Okay.
And one can make similar arguments to some extent with Islam and with Buddhism as well, of course, and with the Jewish traditions, equally so. But there is a historical narrative there. And as I've said in the past, I hope I'm not going to offend anybody here, but if you let us say, that the body of Christ is discovered and it's patently him, we can show how one would show it, and the resurrection is a misunderstanding by deluded apostles. I don't think that's true at all, but I think actually the historical. No, I think that happened. That's the way we go. But that's you have to go and read stuff by people like Tom Wright and all that area if we want to go down that area. But again, it's not as much as anything else. I'm not trying to import these arguments to bolster my ideas about the gap between animal minds and human minds. Other than one might say, if you look at the world as a gift, for instance, then you can see, a theological resonance to that, and that would be something which I think anybody who followed a particular faith might be. But let us say this skeleton is discovered, and patently was the chap who was crucified in AD 33 by Pontius Pilate. Then I think I'd just say, well, okay, the coming hasn't happened. I'd more or less have to be, I suppose, go towards the Jewish faith. I imagine. I don't know. But again, we don't lose sleep about these sorts of things. And I fully understand, especially in these days, all the tensions and all the rest of it. And, the fact that the science in particular, and biologists especially, less so amongst the physicists, I think, are pretty nervous about, these religious arguments and seeing the amount of harm they can do. I agree. Yeah, I know. I'm not trying to dodge this.
Just as an epistemological question, for example, if the arguments that Wright makes for the resurrection, why people should accept it, why don't Jews who read that book accept it and go, oh yeah, that's a great argument. I guess I'm going to convert to Christianity because those are really good arguments. But they don't. And you can't say that, well, they don't understand the arguments. If they understood the arguments, they'd be Christians instead of Jews. They do understand the arguments. They just don't think they're that good. Right?
No, absolutely. I agree entirely. I'm sorry. I'm not, I'm not trying to wriggle or weave on this sort of thing. I mean, I have no dispute at all with what you say. And again, all one can say, from the Christian perspective, I'm simply say, well, as God made the world and so forth, and we don't have to get diverted to big bangs or any of that sort of stuff. Then, as C.S. Lewis sort of famously said, because and I'm an enormous admirer of him for a whole set of reasons, but he struggled his way from a position of atheism to idealism, and then ultimately to Christianity, of course. But he sort of said the idea that I was looking for Christianity. You must be joking. It's as likely as a mouse looking for a cat. He just felt. Yeah. But again, he was. He and others were involved, and they're with a chap called Owen Barfield, who had, I think, very original ideas about the origins of language, and Tolkien, of course, famously enough in another sort of respect. But all of these people and others, again, are in a sense part of your same story as to that gap. What is it about our imaginative powers? What is it which powers the poetry and the theatre and the music? Why are these things repeatedly transcendent? And of course, for some people, they're not. I'm certainly not trying to imagine everybody's got to follow my argument. All I'm saying, this is where I am. No more. Well, nothing very exciting, I'm afraid.
Well, that's fine. In other words, it's a personal truth for you. You're not claiming that other people should accept it, and here's the 12 arguments for it or whatever, right?
Others have done that. And again, you simply. Yeah, but that's okay. And they do it much better than I possibly could.
Well, actually, what I'm asking is it a useful enterprise? Maybe you don't do it, but if it is an effective enterprise, and I've read C.S. Lewis. I took a course in the writings of C.S. Lewis at Pepperdine University. Actually, we read everything he wrote. He's a beautiful writer. Yeah. But still, later I wasn't convinced. And in other words, it's a religious truth that's different from an empirical scientific truth. Like with, just say, climate change. At some point you get a consensus among climate scientists that global warming is real and human caused. I don't see that happening in religion, where you get a consensus of 97% of observers who read all the evidence and evaluate the arguments, and they all decide, well, that's the right one, and all these other ones are just cultural constructions or something like that. I don't see that happening in religion.
No, well, I think it's, again, it's an area of discussion, but I mean, one can actually plot, beyond the resurrection and so forth, through the various councils and so forth in first of all the Byzantine Empire and then subsequently across the world, sort of efforts to try and interpret these things through the perspective of people who come from very different cultures, and that in its own way sort of suggests you can get a toehold in that particular sense. But with regard to your scientific empiricism, of course, I mean, there are things you can go out, but it's not quite the same. And with regard to climate change, there's little doubt that if you put a fair amount of a greenhouse gas, things will change. And of course, we've done the experiment in the past over the last 2 million years. So, but on the other hand, I don't think things are necessarily always as cut and dried as they are in any sort of science. And this is not trying to escape your point, but I was reading an unpublished manuscript, well, it's an archived manuscript, going right back to animal behavior stuff, and actually pointing out that there's a huge pressure to find positive results which reinforce the idea that there is not a gap, effectively, that they've got human-like cognitive capacities in your crow or your chimpanzee or whatever. And negative results, which are equally important from a scientific perspective, are hardly ever included at all. And also, I mean, I don't want to get too carried away, and again, it's slightly sensitive still, but of course, we're just coming out of this COVID epidemic. And at least in my country, I think it's fair to say that there was a great deal of talk about following the science. Well, what we do know is, to the first approximation, these watertight models produced by a variety of groups in this country were wrong. They were. The first one, was a bad overestimate of death, and the reason for this actually is because we're humans, and people knew very early on, as they did in Sweden, that actually, it would be a good idea not to go to many parties over the next few weeks. What do you think about that? And people were already beginning to self-isolate. And then subsequently, especially, I mean, I know the history in America has been somewhat different, and what's happening in Hong Kong and China at the moment is yet another story. So I'm not saying this is applying all over the world, far from it. But the fact of the matter is, I think, and I was trying to persuade some colleagues at a meeting yesterday, I'm not sure science sensu lato has done itself a lot of credit in the last couple of years.
That's a good point. But say the Big Bang Theory or the theory of evolution is not likely to be overturned at this point. We're pretty confident. Most scientists, there's a consensus, a convergence of evidence from multiple lines of inquiry. The Big Bang happened, and the theory of evolution is solid, and so on. Okay, so there's gaps. The gaps are filled with what? So you're in what way does a deity reach into the system and stir the particles to create more complex brains, to create consciousness or a moral sense, or what is your sense about that? How's the gap filled by a deity?
Well, I don't have a well-articulated sense at all, I'm afraid. And again, such as a few listeners we have left, it's sort of the creative process, as I understand it, is that what we do as humans, and this is something Tolkien was very interested in, a number of other people, and Eliot, I think it's rather different. I'm no expert in this area. Is that we were sub-creators. We were able to make things in a certain sense, not out of nothing, because of course we're bodies and all the rest of it. And that in that earlier book, The Ruins of Evolution, how the universe, the subtitles, how the universe became self-aware. What a cheek! It doesn't say anything about that in the book at all. It's very naughty of me. But the sense there is that an atheist or an agnostic can easily see that perspective in a totally rational and sensible way. I'm not saying that these people really got to pull their socks up. Very much the reverse. But as I see the world and the universe, it's a sort of self-fructifying process where out of some pretty unpropitious beginnings, we now end up, with this species, which some of them are possibly deluded, but possibly not, to imagine that there's a God. And certainly with my limited understanding of theology, I'm not rolling together what in the trade's called creatio ex nihilo with the Big Bang. Far from it, and any more than I would with multiverses or anything else. I mean, these areas, are as far as our evidence can take us. And I agree entirely. You can't sort of start exporting things and saying, well, what happened in Palestine in AD 33? has got an immediate bearing on the atomic weight of barium.
Are you that? So you're saying this is my faith. This is what I believe. I'm not claiming I can prove it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. In a sense, yes. I would suggest, and and I can equally imagine people. And obviously, you talk to quite a lot of these people as well, but each one of them has sort of a deep resonance of meaning that they feel that they're not ciphers, but in one way or another, they're part of the larger picture. And of course, this can go seriously wrong if you decide that your larger picture is totally correct and everybody else is totally incorrect, and that leads to unhappiness on a global scale. Thank you very much. But I perfectly appreciate your very gentle probing into this sort of area, and I apologise for not being able to sort of reply in a way which would provide any sort of coherence. But it is that because we have this sense of creative powers, and because we know that by and large we don't do it too well, but every now and again you come across this is just a cliche, but you come across a piece of music, or you're in the academia in Venice, and there you are, and there's a lot of paintings there, and you see one in particular, and you think, actually I can think of another one in another church in Venice, that's another sort. How on earth did he do that? What is he doing here? And one can extend that sort of stuff. And most people say, well, it's because of my culture, because of my background, and my education, all those sorts of things. But I suspect actually what that's telling you is that here you've got the species which really has got something interesting in it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. It's what we're able to do is stunning. Question is why. So let me ask you, what's the purpose of life? How do you answer that question? You've hinted at this in many of your writings and interviews I've seen you give.
I don't have any useful answer for that at all. I mean, by and large, it's from my own limited experience. Not really, because to the first approximation, not to make too big a hash of things, but who hasn't, frankly, in that sort of area. But it is well. It's not. Needless to say, I'm not going to answer your question. Quite right too. But what I like to do is, and of course, this last 2 years have been fascinating in that respect for mostly rather negative reasons. But I just sort of fascinated as one watches humans, and just trying to stand without being a sort of peeping Tom or anything like that, but just an observer. And of course, all these actions which we take completely for granted, one could get sort of distracted into gestures and so forth. And again, there's a profound difference in the way we use our gestures. And unfortunately, keep my hands largely out of sight, not deliberately. It's just, and the thing again and again is just how utterly peculiar we are. And if we can just sort of stand back and, if you think about, okay, I mean, the worst things like warfare and genocide and the rest of it, unfortunately, are part of this equation. Horrible as they, I don't want to get stuck into that area. But if you see a football match or a baseball, no doubt in your country, whatever, or when you see people in love, or when you see a group of people, students chatting in the street, and they're totally oblivious to everything else. They should be, because they're immortal, and all the rest of it. And there they are, just hooked on some particular idea, and you just sort of think, this is brilliant. And I'm afraid that chimpanzees aren't doing that, and they never will.
No, they're not.
So if there's a purpose in life, it's just to sort of be extremely happy to see these people doing utterly remarkable things in a way they don't realize.
Yeah, I think the theistic sense I get from most believers is that if there's not an outside source, then the universe is meaningless. I've heard William Lane Craig make this argument. If in the materialistic worldview, the universe comes to an end, billions of years from now. And so what we're doing now doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It matters. It matters to me and my friends and my family, my loved ones. How I treat other people matters to them in the here and now. You, on this Test of Faith show you did, you made a comment about, in a materialistic worldview, Auschwitz is meaningless, but in a theistic worldview, everything will be ultimately reconciled. Well, Auschwitz matters to the Jews now. I mean, now, here in the here and now, not billions of years from now, or not some God in some other world. It matters now, doesn't it?
Oh, I think it matters permanently. It's not not only a matter of historical memory. Again, the theistic traditions are pretty strong on that. These things are not forgotten. They may be, again, I mean, the standard things we have when we remember the people who've been beneficiaries to my college and so forth, those known and unknown and all the rest of it. None of that is forgotten at all. And obviously, from my perspective, what happened then, and indeed what seems to be going on to some extent now in other parts of the world, is this sort of, we're having a chat with a colleague just yesterday about the nature of fascism, and not in the usual sort of knee-jerk description, but how these things happen. But no, I that's what's terrifying about it. It is because in a meaningless universe, that's just a lot of bipeds being put into a chamber which has got Zyklon B being chucked through the roof. And in a literal sense, that's what it was. But in every other respect, it was a complete abomination.
Yes. Yes, but it is, regardless of whether there's a God or not, or there's an afterlife or not. In other words, whether there's an afterlife or not, no one knows for sure. This is the life we live in now. And so we have to behave ourselves and treat other people and hold people accountable. And maybe they'll be held accountable in some cosmic courthouse to come, but who knows? And so we don't want to wait for that. Let's put the war criminals on trial now. Right?
Well, the Nuremberg Trials in particular, from a legal point of view, I believe are quite interesting. I think the right things were done, but actually, I think it's true to say that it's mostly driven by the American lawyers, I believe. But the strict legality of it could be put open to question. But I'm not saying that they shouldn't happen. I do agree with that, and similarly with these other war criminals and so forth. But the point about this would be that not all theists would subscribe to this, but following C.S. Lewis and so forth, if you want to argue that some people put themselves, beyond the human pale, I'm choosing my words as carefully as I can, and let us say that there's something which in traditional way would be called hell. It's a place you don't want to be. And of course, to the majority of people, they'll regard this as total madness. But the point, what Lewis pointed out in one of his books, was that the point about if you're in, and we know this can be true here and now. You don't have to wait to be dead to find out about these things. The door is always locked from the inside. You are the one who is allowed, if you so wish, and he's got a wonderful short sort of metaphor called the Great Divorce, which you will have read, of course, in your own series. And once again, what I would like to do, so far as I can, is actually just invite people to take slightly different perspective on this. Just say, well, if we were to go down this particular line, would we actually end up with something which, in the longer term, is actually a little bit more interesting, or is it just delusional? I'm reasonably confident about what I'm doing, but
Simon, you sound a little bit like a fideist. I don't know if you know what fideism is, kind of a pragmatism argument about things like God's existence, free will. My friend and colleague Martin Gardner, who's kind of one of the founders of the modern skeptical movement, he was skeptical of the paranormal and all that stuff. But he believed in God, and skeptics and atheists were like, "What? Martin Gardner believes in God?" And he made this argument from William James that there are certain questions that can never be answered by science. And if they're important to you, you can make a leap of faith and just say, this is what I believe. I'm not claiming to prove it. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. It's not an Aquinas like 5 proofs of God, nothing like that. This is just what I believe. And he believed in the afterlife and prayer. Okay. And so my sense is your religiosity or spirituality or whatever is more along those lines than apologetics or intelligent design, creationism, or anything like that.
Good. Yeah, not intelligent design. We can have an ad break here because that is absolutely 1,000%. And I'm not going to go into why.
Okay.
I have lost all patience with these people, but rest assured that I have. But I would, again, be not particular knowledge about William James and so forth, or indeed, the pragmatic philosophy and so forth. But once again, I would, I can see why people would see it that sort of way, but I would prefer to actually, again, just step back slightly from that, as I've already mentioned, just to be more interested in this being a degree of congruence with what goes on, but also something which, I can't play music, I can't write poetry, and all the rest of it. I think I write okay, in a very particular way. And so far as, I have my creativity, and my wife has her own creativities as well. But so far as I do, it is that, this process whereby mysteriously these ideas pour out of the end of my pen.
Mm.
Stuff is typed obviously in the end, but I don't write on a word processor. I use a fountain pen because I have this sort of tactile thing of, the connection as the tool and so forth. And I say, to just keep on, saying that it's not just a sort of dry, leap of faith sort of stuff. And to the outside world, of course it looks like that, because they think, well, how can he be so silly? But from my perspective, it's much more, that these things make a sense. And it's not one where you're going to be able to provide a list of arguments and say, well, really, Michael, you need to think about this thing. We can go back, to the people who are going to be the apologists, and I've got plenty of time to read them. But it's not, if I have any skill, it's not in that area, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so maybe it's more like a
mythological.
I'm looking at the screen,
by the way. I don't want to worry you. I'm quite dark, and I'm quite happy here. I'm getting some reflection off my specs, but I can put a light on if you like.
No, you're good.
Because obviously it's getting dark.
Yeah,
that's fine. Okay, I don't mind at all. If you're happy to carry on,
you're
like
okay,
this, sure.
and I'll bring it to a head here because we're going up on an hour and 45 minutes here.
Sure, yeah.
It's a great conversation. No, I love this. I'm not trying to talk you out of anything. I'm just curious what other thoughtful, intelligent people like yourself think about these things and how they arrive there. Maybe it's more a mythological truth. I've been kind of playing with this idea of like religious truths, political truths, mythological truths, scientific truths. How we think about things in a different way. Like I was having this conversation with Jordan Peterson, and he's big into mythology and Jung and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and so you read the great Russian novels, and to ask, well, are they true? You're missing the point. Of course they're not true. It's a novel, but it's a deeper truth, about human nature, life, conflict, human relations, and that's kind of a mythological truth, and that has value too. My sense is maybe that's kind of how you're thinking about that, because you talked about Homo narrans, that the Christian story is a mythology, not myth as in it's not true, myth as in it's a story that has meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And Jordan Peterson is one of these people who, in our opinion, is somebody who's really done a lot of really good rescue work recently. Against and Roger Scruton before him, as chap philosopher in this country, were people who were pushing against a tide which I'm not sure would take us in the direction we wish to be. But this is of course controversial, and not everybody will agree with it. But the thing about as you say, the mythology is, as again I mentioned in passing in this new book, and very much based again on Lewis and Barfield and Tolkien and so forth, is we are mythopoeic. That is when one's involved with these things, they resonate at such a deep level, and you most likely, people would say, well, it's there's a particular part of brain, whatever, needs this sort of stuff to keep you sort of mentally stable. But I just don't think. I think it's rubbish. It's those myths there are foundational to how we see ourselves in the world, and of course we know that in certain societies those myths can go down some very dark avenues. But they're there whether you like it or not, and they will be employed sometimes for some really suspect purposes. They're not harmless, but they can be enormously enriching.
Right. Well, so one of the arguments I like for encountering extraterrestrial intelligences is they're likely to be far ahead of us, culturally, technologically, scientifically, and so on. And maybe they know the answers to some of these questions, like, oh, consciousness, we figured that out 10,000 years ago. Here's what it is. Oh, okay. What dark energy. Oh, dark energy. Yeah, we figured it out and we use it.
Oh, that's a simple one.
Our spaceships or something, yes. Yeah, so much of this is driven by the unknown. Just there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah. Well, I probably read the wrong sort of science fiction, but that which I've done, which has dealt with non Star Trek stuff, contact with aliens, like the book The Sparrow, and what's that one by Bliss? It'll come in a moment. These actually, some of them have a very interesting theological underpinning to them, because they then what happens, for instance. The name's gone completely out. James. Never mind, I won't struggle anymore. What happens when you go to a planet which is not undergone what we in Christianity would call the fall? What happens when you go to a planet which is innocent?
Oh, so right, forth. Right.
This is unpacked in an absolutely fascinating way, and there are quite a few ones like that. And again, I maybe erroneously you say that'd be very useful. I make a passing reference to that again in the book. A few hints on dark matter would be terribly helpful. Really would like to know. Thank you very much. Get across to Stockholm straight away. Pick up that gong and all the rest of it. But,
by the way, there have been some surveys. There have been some surveys of Christians asking, or religious people in general, various religious faiths, if we encountered extraterrestrial intelligences, would this shake your faith? And the overall response was no, not at all. God can do whatever He wants.
No, not at all. No. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, my critics might say, well, the reason I want to be alone is because of, as what in the trade is called, a scandal of particularity with regard to Christianity. But I can just say that's not the case. Better or worse, it really doesn't matter very much in that sort of regard. But yeah. So, but again, it's that sort of metaphysical encounter which I think is much more thrilling than just the boring stuff of, what sort of laser cannon are you using this day? Sort of that sort of, and once again, I'm not an anthropologist, but I can well imagine there's a way of looking at science fiction in terms of, galactic empires and so forth. And, if they're anything like the empires we've had, by and large, they're probably best avoided, mostly. They tend not to go in a benign direction. But, I'm not preaching about that.
Let me just ask you real quick, because you're something of a theist, and I'm going to guess you have some belief in free will or compatibilism or whatever, and yet you're a scientist. We live in a deterministic universe. I've had a bunch of people on this show. I think about this problem all the time. I'm a compatibilist along the lines of Dan Dennett. How do you square that circle of having volition in a determined universe, or do you?
Because, well, I don't in any easy sort of sense. But I think if we knew the world, I use the world in a sort of a sort of medieval sense. If we knew the world as it really was, a little bit like your mention of dualism, this apparent tension would just disappear. It's just, and this is not an answer, obviously, but it is the thing that the world has to be organised in a way. In fact, I had a recent correspondence with a colleague about determinism and so forth. And he's arguing very strongly indeed, that determinism is the fact. It's not that one should be fatalistic about it, but that's just the way the world is. But my own sense is that that free will is part of what is woven into the beginning. That is, we make the choice. We always make the choice. And the metaphors and the legends and the myths and the fairy tales, all of those. And G.K. Chesterton was extremely good on this with regard to fairy tales. He kept on saying, you can do whatever you like in the castle or the garden, but you must not ever pick up that spoon. It's totally arbitrary. What's the matter with that? But no. And of course, the idiot picks it up, and sure enough, the castle disappears or whatever. And what, of course, Chesterton's trying to explain is that that there are parameters which you don't necessarily understand that simply are not allowed to be broken. And within those parameters, you have unlimited freedom. But you're still ultimately constrained by something which is not you and is the person who created you. So this is I'm an enormous fan of G.K. Chesterton as well, and that's another bag of stories. But so the point there is, again, is if we stay with this language, and perfectly understandably, of dualism, of compatibilism, whatever you like, and so forth, I'm not sure we'll get very much further. You can adopt your world picture, and it's going to last as long as you don't ask too many awkward questions.
Let me ask one last awkward question in the lightning round. Please. Here with your convergent evolution.
You've been very patient.
Let's apply your convergent evolution to technology and innovation and AI. Could AI become sentient and conscious based on these kind of principles of, just the cumulative evolution of technology? Could a computer close the gap, so to speak?
Do you want a very short answer or a fairly long answer?
I know there's a little out of your field. You're a biologist, but yeah,
I'll
please.
give you the very short answer first of all, no. And the long answer is absolutely not. How's that? So,
okay.
I'm not a computer waller at all, as anybody who knows me will confirm with a wry smile. I've been reading several papers, but just by chance, they once came across, across the screen, so to speak, arguing that no machine will ever be thinking. That what that machine does is not the same as what we do in thinking. You always have to program that machine. And I know, of course, there is this promise that just around the corner, and it could happen. I can see that. I'm not, but there are some interesting logical arguments that that what we call speech is not the same as computer code. As I said, it's cognitive, and it's not to say it might not be useful to have an adjunct to one's brain, which allowed in a certain sense, of course, a bit like all the other tools we have. Like again, I mentioned in the book, drawing on other people. Yeah, it's precisely these are cognitive extensions of ourselves. I mean, they may have their own materiality to them, but they are part of us. We reach out, and even if the thing's on the edge of the solar system, it is still connected to us. And that's something which is actually different from animal tools. Animal tools are simply functional, but as I said, they never dream of making one tool for another. So, although again, the sort of the received wisdom is that as the computational power increases, then one day you'll find printed out a note saying, "I'm feeling a bit, being a bit peckish. Would you like to go out for a date? Well, God, I don't want to date a computer, whatever happens." But I'm following again. I haven't got the references to hand, I'm afraid, but I've come across several recent papers which are very sort of, they're not comic in terms of amusing, but they've got this sort of exasperation, saying, this is not going to happen. And again, an unreconstructed Englishman. I never told you what happened my 70th birthday. No, that's no sorry.
That's
it's
right.
bound to be.
Yes, give us that. Yeah, let's bring it full circle to that. So what'd you do?
Yeah, then we can say you can say good morning. I'll say good night. But no. We got a local airfield which was actually used in the Second World War, and Douglas Bader was based there amongst other people. I forget the name of the squadron. In any case, they have a couple of Spitfires there which are still flying. And it's not everybody's idea of a good day out, but I must say, I thought it was a cracking gift from. Yeah, so
oh my God!
Ironically, these Spitfires, a guy who flew me, a guy called Stu, is absolutely brilliant. It's terrific. It was great fun. And these Spitfires were sold to the Irish Air Force, and I'm actually technically quarter Irish, so I think I can get away with this. And they put in an extra cockpit for training purposes. And then a couple of them came back to this country, so they pop you in the back cockpit, and you've got dual controls, and you're technically allowed to touch them. And you also have a thing you're sitting on, which looks like a cushion, but at the top of the cushion on your thing, it's got a ripcord. Yes, that's right. It's a parachute. So, it's for people such as myself. It's being perhaps a little too much like a boy still. It's a fabulous experience.
Totally.
And, very.
I was gonna do one of these trips in a B-17 bomber in Southern California here.
Right.
And I it was like $400. I'm thinking, should I do this? And then the plane, like a week later, the plane went down. I thought, okay, I think I'm not going to do this. Because they're old planes.
When they gave us a brief, yeah, exactly. This plane's 80 years old. And when he gave them the briefing, he said, I must tell you that, this plane is 80 years old. It's got one engine and one pilot, okay?
Right.
So if you're getting cold feet, that's quite all right. We'll give you your money back. We don't expect you to engage in mock heroics, but nobody stepped forward, and so it was a heck of a good time. But that's another bag of stories, and it's part of course, my country in a different way with the American involvement is part of our mythology, and often it's regarded as being either out of date or quaint or so forth. And it's my father's generation, and it's be remembered by later ones. That's it, but it will not be forgotten.
Well, happy 70th birthday to you, Simon Conway Morris. Thanks for coming on the show. And I have to tell you, though, you're still a young man. I talked to Ernst Mayr on his 100th birthday because I kind of knew him and I knew his birthday. So I called him and I said, what are you doing? He goes, on your birthday? He goes, I'm working on 2 books and 3 papers. And he went on and on. I'm like, okay, oh boy, I hope I have that kind of energy when I'm 100. what's next for you?
Yeah.
I know you're still writing and researching. What are you working on next?
I've got a couple of technical papers with a friend in Canada, but I'm sort of getting my mind very slowly round to possibly some sort of successor to the book you've kindly mentioned today. But it's a tricky one. I think I'm thinking a little bit more about the language question, and a little bit more, not too serious, about the consciousness question, and the like. Whether how it's going to be weaved together, I'm not quite sure. But it's work in progress, and it's very early days, thank goodness. Yeah, so we'll see how this one goes. Good. In any case, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll have you back on in a couple of years, and maybe we'll have solved the problem of consciousness by then. Although I doubt it.
Thank you.
like with AI,
Michael, I should say.
I was going to say, like with AI, it's 5 years away and always will be.
Yeah, maybe so. But can I say thank you? I mean, I always enjoy the conversations, but thank you for, I'm not flattering you at all, but thank you for a very gentle interview.
Okay. I guess that's what it was. That sounds good to me.